This weekend we will be celebrating the life, legacy, and ministry of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a social activist and pastor who led the civil rights movement in the United States of America. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stands on the shoulders of a long tradition of religious leaders in the American context who have been engaged in the struggle for freedom. He stands on the shoulders of Reverend Nat Turner, Reverend Gabriel Prosser, two religious leaders who actually led insurrections in the United States. And he stands on the shoulders of such great leaders as Bishop James Holly, Reverend Reverdy Ransom, Reverend Nathaniel Paul, Harriet Tubman, and Soujourner Truth. Soujourner Truth used to, when she would give abolitionist speeches, begin every speech with two sentences. The issue of freedom is the issue that's on the table. And then she would say, "Chillins, I talks to God and God talks to me." In other words, my spirituality has everything to do with the struggle for freedom. There is a connection between my faith in God and my political activism on behalf of freedom. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stands on the shoulders of those ancestors. When he came to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954, fresh off of a PhD in which he had written a doctoral dissertation on Paul Tillich and the philosopher Henry Wyman, Dr. Martin Luther King did not have any idea that shortly after that, a woman named Rosa Parks would sit down on a bus and refuse to move. And the community, as it organized, decided that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the newest preacher in town, who was not yet known to the power structure, should be the one who would lead the movement. From December 1954 to December 1955, the African community in Montgomery, Alabama, walked rather than rode the buses and protested against the desegregation that characterized Southern life at that time. In December 1956, the Supreme Court declared desegregation was unconstitutional. And that set Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on a trajectory to become the leading civil rights leader in the 20th century. He founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and with other religious leaders and other leaders in the community, led a movement to establish the reality and freedom of Black people. It is extraordinary that Dr. Martin Luther King learned from those who he studied. He learned from Gandhiism, Mohandas Gandhi, who had affirmed the importance of nonviolent protest. He learned from his reading of Karl Marx that faith without works, faith that did not address the real problems of human beings, was a really dry as dust religion and useless to nobody, and actually is the kind of religion that people call a religious tradition that is useless. Dr. Martin Luther King taught us many things. The first thing he taught us was that our spirituality was a potent force in the ongoing struggle to bring about social change. Dr. Martin Luther King taught us that to be grounded in the specific African American prophetic transformational spirituality that had emerged in the context of chattel slavery among African American people was a dream that should be pursued. And that specific religious tradition, the African American prophetic transformational Christian tradition is the tradition that he stood in and represents. It is a tradition that affirms the connection between faith and political action and activism on behalf of those who are oppressed. Martin Luther King's trajectory also taught us the importance of beginning to evolve. What began as a civil rights movement for African American people extended beyond the specific struggle of black people to a universal struggle for human rights for all people. Dr. Martin Luther King affirmed the importance of inclusivity. He often said, unless all are free, none are free. Dr. Martin Luther King affirmed the importance of growing and evolving in how he thought about the world. What began initially as a struggle for freedom for black people and the right to get votes evolved from a struggle against racial inequity to a struggle that was inclusive of the fight for economic equity. In his speech given at Riverside Church in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King clearly demonstrated his understanding that poverty was central to many of the problems that affected the lives of black, brown people. And therefore he began to think about what it meant to engage an economic structure that systemically perpetrated against those people. Dr. Martin Luther King came to understand that economic equity had to be central to the work of liberation. In addition, Dr. Martin Luther King suggested in his great sermon at Riverside Church that a critique of the Vietnam War was a critique not only of the capitalist economy, but a critique of those who made war and who benefited from making war and the military-industrial complex that thrived based on the war. Finally, Dr. Martin Luther King came to the conclusion, in his words, that the dream that he articulated on the Great March on Washington, the dream he articulated, a dream that was inclusive of all people, black people, brown people, white people, all people, I would argue gay people, that dream that was inclusive of all, Dr. Martin Luther King became a nightmare as he continued his struggle over the many years. He said that dream became a nightmare, and it expressed the frustration that any social activist would experience as you seek to bring about change. It is extraordinary that we represent Faith in Action, Pico, California network that is deeply committed to racial equity and economic equity, that has prioritized housing equity and a universal basic income. Dr. Martin Luther King clearly understood that central to the freedom and harmony and prosperity of all implied a critique of the system and an engagement with systemic change. That is the kind of work that we do, and I am honored to speak on his behalf and to indicate that he is truly representative of the work that we do as an organization that engages in long-term organizing in order to bring about equity for all in the land in which we live and love.